планирования в современных условиях рыночной экономики, сказали о том, для чего это нужно и в каких сферах применяется, и начали рассматривать понятийный аппарат в области прогнозирования и планирования. Мы остановились на макроэкономических показателях, которые характеризуют развитие территории, развитие национальной экономики. Мы обозначили среди них валовый внутренний продукт, валовый национальный доход, причем сказали о том, что очень важен показатель именно исходя из нужд населения. Мы сказали о показателях, характеризующих уровень жизни, уровень инфляции, безработицы и уровень потребительских цен. По большому счету, это основные макроэкономические показатели, которые заложены в моделях социально-экономического прогнозирования. В последующем эти отдельно макроэкономические показатели можно разложить еще на ряд дополнительных показателей, более детализированных. Далее мы с вами сказали о том, что очень важна отраслевая структура экономики, да, понимать ее и предсказывать, как будет она развиваться. Вот сегодня на ректорате только Иван Григорьевич говорил, он вернулся с Дайдаровского форума, о котором я вам вчера рассказывала, где посетил одну из конференций касаемо макроэкономического прогнозирования до 2030 года. И, к сожалению, прогнозы не внушают оптимизма, потому что в ближайшей перспективе прогнозируется рост ВВП порядка 2%. Это очень мало для нашей экономики. Причем в России существует так называемая «белая книга», где рассматриваются приоритетные направления научных разработок для страны и, в принципе, где закладывается финансирование этих приоритетных направлений. Так вот, анализ этой «белой книги» показал, что у нас заведомо закладывает в перспективные направления то, что уже давно развито в мире, что уже давно существует в европейских странах, в Америке. То есть, понимаете, мы опять идем по пути догоняющего развития. Да? О опережающем развитии речи нет вообще. Нанотехнологии, которые у нас сейчас все с ними носятся и говорят, как это хорошо, как это нужно развивать, на самом деле уже в Европе уже давно развиты, и те нововведения, которые у нас происходят, они уже давно никому не нужны. Это так же, как с айфоном. Да? Слышали, у нас выпустили айфон, который дороже, да? Который, может быть, даже по каким-то параметрам уступает, ну и зачем? То есть для того, чтобы развиваться, для того, чтобы все-таки догнать или хотя бы приблизиться к показателям экономического развития действительно развитых стран, необходимо разрабатывать новые стратегии и новые пути, не такие, то есть идти не по такому пути догоняющему, как мы берем зарубежный опыт, как у нас даже так учат. Да? Мы рассматриваем зарубежный опыт и думаем, как бы его приложить к нашей современной действительности. Так дело не пойдет, так, как показывает практика, как показывают прогнозные оценки, мы далеко, конечно, в развитии не уйдем. И, к сожалению, все макроэкономические прогнозы не носят оптимизма, да, но будет видно. Там несколько, на камеру записывать, надеюсь, вырежет, ругали наше правительство, потому что правительство докладывало о том, как все будет, грубо говоря, печально, когда в то время, как они должны были свои.
Recently, the diets of California children ages 2 through 7 were analyzed to determine the cancer and non-cancer health effects from food contaminant exposures. Food may be the primary route of exposure to toxic heavy metals, persistent pollutants, and pesticides. Though foodborne toxic contaminants are a concern for all ages, they are of greatest concern for children, who are disproportionately impacted because they're still developing and have greater intake of food and fluids relative to their weight. Pediatric problems that have been linked to preventable environmental toxin exposures include cancer, asthma, lead poisoning, neurobehavioral disorders, learning and developmental disabilities, and birth defects. But the good news is changing one's diet can change one's exposure. A diet high in fish and animal products, for example, results in greater exposure to persistent pollutants like DDT and dioxins and heavy metals than does a plant-based diet, because these compounds bioaccumulate up the food chain, and plants are at the bottom of the food chain. But this sample of California kids was not eating a plant-based diet, and cancer benchmark levels were exceeded by all 364 children for arsenic, the banned pesticide dieldrin, a metabolite of DDT called DDE, and dioxins. Children exceeded safety levels by a greater margin than adults. This is especially of concern for children because all these compounds are suspected endocrine disruptors and thus may impact normal development. Cancer risk ratios were exceeded by over a factor of 100 for arsenic and dioxins. Which foods were the worst? For preschoolers, the #1 food source of arsenic was poultry, though for their parents it was tuna. The #1 source of lead was dairy, and for mercury it was seafood. And the #1 source of the banned pesticides and dioxins was dairy. They didn't split up the groups by gender, but a similar study in Europe found that men had higher levels of some of these pollutants than women. For example, levels of the banned pesticide chlordane. But women who never breastfed were right up there closer along with men, with the lowest levels found in women who had breastfed more than 12 months. It is therefore likely that the lactation-related reduction in blood pollutant levels partially explains the lower body burdens among women compared to men. So cows can lower their levels by giving some to us, then we pass it along to our children. What non-cancer effects might some of these pollutants have? They can affect the immune system. Studies clearly demonstrate the ability of dioxins and related compounds to have a long-lasting and deleterious effect on immune function. This manifests as increased incidence of respiratory infections, ear infections, cough, and sore throat. At first, most of the data was for during infancy, but now we have follow-up studies showing that the immunosuppressive effects of some of these toxins may persist into early childhood. So we should try to reduce our exposure as much as possible. How do we do that? Because these pollutants accumulate in animal fat, consuming a plant-based diet, decreasing meat, dairy, and fish consumption, may reduce exposure for children and adults alike. In the past 2 years, 6 separate meta-analyses have been published on the relationship between fish consumption and type 2 diabetes. The whole point of a meta-analysis, though, is to compile together the best studies done to date and see what the overall balance of evidence shows. The fact that there are 6 different ones published recently highlights how open the question remains. One thread of consistency, though, was that fish consumers in the United States tend to be at greater risk for diabetes. If you include Europe too, then fish eaters appeared to have a 38% increased risk of diabetes. On a per-serving basis, that comes out to be about 5% increase in risk for every serving of fish one has per week. To put that into perspective, a serving of red meat is associated with a 19% increase in risk, but that's per day. Just one serving of fish a week is 5%, so a serving a day would be like a 35% increase in risk, worse than red meat. But why? Well, fish intake and omega-3 fats may increase type 2 diabetes risk by increasing blood sugar levels, as found in a review of the evidence commissioned by the U.S. government. An increase in blood sugars in diabetics given fish oil. Or maybe because the omega-3s cause oxidative stress. A recent study found that the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas don't appear to work as well in people who eat 2 or more servings of fish a week. Or it may be because of the environmental contaminants that build up in fish. It all started with Agent Orange. We sprayed 20 million gallons of this stuff on Vietnam, and some of it was contaminated with trace amounts of dioxins. Though the Red Cross there estimates 1 million Vietnamese were adversely affected, what about all the servicemen, the U.S. servicemen who were exposed, spraying it across the countryside? Reports started showing up that veterans exposed to Agent Orange appeared to have higher diabetes rates than unexposed veterans, a link that's now officially recognized. These so-called persistent organic pollutants are mainly man-made industrial chemicals, and among the most hazardous compounds ever synthesized. They include dioxins, PCBs, certain chlorine-containing pesticides, all of which are highly resistant to breaking down in the environment. Initially described for their deleterious effect on reproductive function and their ability to cause cancer, there is now a growing body of evidence showing that exposure to these pollutants leads to metabolic diseases such as diabetes. This is a breakthrough that should require our greatest attention.
This is from a book called Pandora's Poison. It's written by Joe Thornton. This was a college textbook used in a class called Health in the Environment at the University of Maryland, College Park, a graduate class. And I hate to read it to you, but it's very important. And so here goes. Ecologically speaking, humans are part of the environment, though we often forget it. A contaminated ecosystem means contaminated people. If the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat are contaminated with organochlorines, then we too inevitably become polluted. A host of studies show that organochlorines have invaded not just the far corners of the globe, but also the most intimate corners of our bodies. People are exposed to organochlorines in drinking water, air, and food. For bioaccumulative compounds like the dioxins, pesticides, and PCBs, the food supply is the major source of contamination. According to EPA, over 90% of the average American's dioxin exposures come through the diet. Now, here, keep in mind that dioxin is the most carcinogenic substance known to mankind. It says America's dioxin exposure comes through the diet. Animal foods, meat, dairy, fish, and eggs contain the highest concentrations of dioxin. But smaller exposures also occur through grains, fruits, and vegetables and their oils. From the most volatile or less bioaccumulative organochlorines, air and water play more important roles. For instance, inhalation is an important route of exposure to chlorinated solvents. And drinking water throughout the Midwestern United States is contaminated with the herbicides atrazine and alachlor. The myriad of byproducts formed in the disinfection of drinking water with chlorine also find their way to people mainly through tap water. By drinking, absorption through the skin, so even just taking a bath, you're absorbing chlorine into your body, or inhalation during a shower or bath. Most people in industrialized nations also experience direct exposure to organochlorines in consumer products, lawn and garden chemicals, dry cleaning, clothing, and the workplace. Like unwelcome guests, many organochlorines take up residence in our bodies and refuse to leave. Organochlorines are passed from one generation to the next in extraordinary concentrations through mother's milk and across the placenta. Once organochlorines have taken up residence in a man's fatty tissues, he has no way to get rid of them. These chemicals will be with him more or less until his death. So his organochlorine body burden generally increases slowly throughout his life. A woman, however, has one way to reduce her body burden. She can flush contaminants out of her fat into her breast milk. 16 pesticides, 18 dioxins and furans, 65 PCBs, 11 other aromatic organochlorines, and 19 solvents and other chlorinated aliphatics have been identified in the breast milk of the general U.S. and Canadian population. See Appendix A. The mother's loss in her child's gain, however, the nursing infant is exposed to these compounds during critical periods of development when sensitivity to chemical disruption is particularly high. In other words, the babies are very, very vulnerable to these chemicals. Just as pollutant concentrations are magnified with each step up the food chain, a breastfed baby is subject to doses much higher than the mother ever was. An average nursing infant receives doses of dioxins and PCBs that are 20 and 50 times higher than those of the average adult, respectively. In a year of nursing, a typical baby receives 4 to 12% of his or her entire lifetime dioxin exposure and accumulates a higher body burden than the average 70-year-old man. In fact, the nursing child's dioxin doses exceeds by a factor of 6 to 10,000 the standard of every government in the world for an adult's acceptable daily intake. I'd like to add my own comment here. In Sweden, it's mothers that go to the office of governing officials to complain about pollution. We cannot have it, they say. It's because babies and the unborn are much more vulnerable to pollutants than adults. Pollutants can cause them to suffer reduced intelligence, asthma, hyperactivity, impulsivity, low birth weight, the inability to concentrate, autism, and increased risk of preterm birth, weakened immunity, developmental delays in motor and mental skills, and more.